Live. Well, in a significant development, India in recent months has barred domestic manufacturers of military drones from using components made in China over concerns about security vulnerabilities. This has been reported by global news agency Reuters today, quoting some of India's defense and industry officials and documents. The measure comes amid tensions between nuclear-armed neighbors India and China, and as New Delhi pursues a military modernization that envisages greater use of unmanned quadcopters, long-endurance systems and other autonomous platforms. But as the nascent Indian industry looks to meet the military's needs, security leaders are worried that intelligence gathering could be compromised by Chinese-made parts in drones' communication functions, cameras, radio transmission and operating software. India's approach complements phased import restrictions on surveillance drones since 2020 and is being implemented through military tenders. According to Reuters, at two meetings in February and March to discuss drone tenders, Indian military officials told potential bidders that equipment or subcomponents from countries sharing land borders with India will not be acceptable for security reasons. One tender document said such subsystems had security loopholes that compromised critical military data and called for vendors to disclose components' origin. A senior defense official has been quoted as saying that the reference to neighboring countries was a euphemism for China and that the Indian industry had become dependent on the world's second largest economy despite concern about cyber attacks. Beijing has always denied its involvement in cyber attacks. China's Commerce Ministry, which last week announced export controls on some drones and drone-related equipment, hasn't responded to questions about India's measures. And it's not just India. The US Congress in 2019 banned the Pentagon from buying or using drones and components made in China. India's Prime Minister Narendra Modi has sought to build India's drone capability to thwart perceived threats, including from China, whose forces have clashed with Indian forces along the disputed border in recent years. India has set aside 1.6 trillion rupees, that's $19.77 billion, for military modernization in 2023-24, of which 75% is reserved for domestic industry. But the ban on Chinese parts has raised the cost of making military drones locally by forcing manufacturers to source components elsewhere. 70% of goods in India's supply chain were made in China. India relies on foreign manufacturers for both parts and entire systems as it lacks the know-how to make certain types of drones. A government-funded program to produce an indigenous medium-altitude, long-endurance unmanned system called Tapas has been delayed by at least half a decade. It has met most requirements but needs further work to fulfill the military's goal of a drone that can reach an operational altitude of 30,000 feet and remain airborne for 24 hours. Apart from Tapas, which is expected to begin military trials later this month, work is also underway on a stealth unmanned platform and a high-altitude long-endurance platform, but both are years away. To fill these gaps, India announced in June, during Prime Minister Narendra Modi's state visit to the US, that it would buy 31 MQ-9 drones from the United States for over $3 billion. In February, Finance Minister Nirmala Sitharaman pledged that one quarter of this year's $2.83 billion budget for defense research and development would be for private industry. Indian Defence Forces are set to acquire 97 made-in-India drones for surveillance purposes along China and Pakistan borders. After the decision to buy 31 Predator drones from the US, India is now moving towards acquiring 97 highly capable drones made under the Make in India project. The drones to be acquired by the forces would be in addition to the existing fleet of over 46 Heron UAVs acquired by the three forces over the years in their respective fleets. The drones, which are already in service, are going to be upgraded by the Hindustan Aeronautics Limited in partnership with the original equipment manufacturers through the Make in India route, where they will have to upgrade their capabilities within the country using over 60% Indian content. All right, now let's turn our attention to another major development. Well, this comes as a huge blow to big tech. Norway has announced it will impose a fine of 1 million crowns a day on Meta, the parent company of Facebook, WhatsApp and Instagram, over privacy breaches. The new rule kicks in on the 14th of this month. This was announced by the country's Data Protection Authority. The Norwegian watchdog said Meta cannot harvest user data, including their physical location, and employ to target advertising at them, a practice often used by most tech companies to generate revenue. The Mark Zuckerberg-owned company had until the 4th of August to address this issue and inform the regulator that it had handled it. However, Meta failed to take a call and the watchdog took action, with fines running till the 3rd of November. Authorities say, according to Meta, this will take several months at the very earliest for them to implement, and we don't know what the consent mechanism will look like, and in the meantime, people's rights are being violated every single day. Meta said the change was made to address regulatory requirements in the region and stems from an order in January by Ireland's Data Protection Commissioner. Meta's lead EU regulator to reassess the legal basis on how it targets ads. Norway is not a member of the European Union but is part of the European single market. This is not the first instance when Meta has received a hefty fine amount. In May, the company was fined a record $1.3 billion, that's 1.2 billion euros, by the European Union for failing to comply with a warning by the top EU court related to the data transfer of Facebook's EU users to servers in the United States. According to Ireland's Data Protection Commission, which acts on behalf of the European Union, the social media giant failed to pay heed to a top court warning aimed at protecting users' data from the security services in the US once it's shipped to servers across the Atlantic. The Commission also alleged that Meta continued data transfers to the US without addressing the risks to the fundamental rights and freedoms of people whose data was being transferred to the United States. Now, the DPC had been investigating Meta Ireland's transfer of personal data from the EU to the US since 2020. Meta has also been ordered to stop the processing of personal data of European users in the US within 6 months. Meta has said it would appeal the ruling, including the fine, and that there would be no immediate disruption to Facebook in Europe. The company said the root of the issue stemmed from a conflict of law between US rules on access to data and the privacy rights of Europeans. The FTC's Bureau of Consumer Protection began investigating Facebook all the way back in March 2018 after it was revealed that personal data was illegally harvested from an online personality quiz and sold to Cambridge Analytica, a data analytics firm. There were subsequent claims that the data may have been used to try and influence the outcome of the 2016 US presidential election and the UK Brexit referendum. Although only 270,000 people took the quiz, whistleblower Christopher Wiley alleged that the data of some 50 million users, mainly in the US, was harvested without their explicit consent via their friend networks. But Cambridge Analytica was not the only firm to have access to users' personal data. The data was gathered using Facebook's infrastructure at the time, and many other developers had in fact taken advantage of it without authorization. Facebook was fined $500,000 by the UK's data protection watchdog for its role in the Cambridge Analytica data scandal. All right, finally some news from the world of cinema, and it is not good news. Well, we are ending the show tonight with a tribute to William Friedkin, the generation-defining director who brought a visceral realism to the 1970s hits The French Connection and The Exorcist, and was quickly anointed one of Hollywood's top directors when he was just in his 30s, has died at the age of 87 after a long illness. Friedkin had won the Best Director Oscar for The French Connection. Film critics say Friedkin was a director who created multiple visceral and unforgettable experiences for moviegoers. Another film of his that stood out was his neo-noir corrupt cop drama To Live and Die in LA. Friedkin gave his audience a number of classics in the early 90s, but his queasy and inspired masterpiece was undoubtedly The Exorcist from 1973, adapted by William Peter Blatty from his original novel. This was the quintessential horror pleasure of that period, the era of people lining up around the block to get into the cinema to see something that they hoped and feared would scare them half to death, a roller coaster ride out into the void. Critics say Friedkin made horror thrillingly contemporary and respectable. William Friedkin cemented his legacy early with The French Connection, which was based on a true story and deals with the efforts of maverick New York City police detective James Popeye Doyle to track down Frenchman Fernando Rey, mastermind of a large drug pipeline funneling heroin into the US. It contains one of the most thrilling chase scenes ever filmed. The movie, which was made for just $2 million, became a box office hit when it was released in 1971 and also won Academy Awards for Best Picture, Screenplay and Film Editing, and led critics to hail Friedkin, who was just 32, as a leading member of a new generation of filmmakers. He followed with an even bigger blockbuster, The Exorcist, released in 1973, based on William Peter Blatty's best-selling novel about a 12-year-old girl possessed by the devil. The harrowing scenes of the girl's possession and a splendid cast helped make the film a box office sensation. It was so scary for its era that many viewers fled the theatres before it was over, and some reported being unable to sleep for days afterwards. The Exorcist received 10 Oscar nominations, including one for Friedkin as director and 2 for Blatty's script and sound as well. With that second success, Friedkin would go on to direct movies and TV shows well into the 21st century. He told interviewer Tom Huddleston in 2012, and I quote, "My films have always been a study of human behavior at its extremes. They're not aimed at young people, they're aimed at adults. Is there a line I wouldn't cross? I don't know." Other noteworthy Friedkin films included the 1985 crime thriller To Live and Die in LA, the 2006 mental disintegration chiller Bug, and the twisted 2011 black comedy Killer Joe. Friedkin remained an active director even in his later years, continuing to helm projects right into his 80s. His last cinematic endeavor, titled The Caine Mutiny Court Martial, is scheduled for its debut at the upcoming Venice Film Festival this year.
When I think of the chase scene from French Connection, the one thing that always, and this scares me when I drive, the one thing that scares me the most of all is when the baby carriage comes out and he hits it and everything explodes, and it scared the hell. That was because I drive and I'm afraid that something like that's going to happen to me, and it was all going so fast. It was just a great movie. It was a great chase scene specifically. Yeah, it was wonderful. But he was a brilliant director.
It was one of the first horror movies that I saw when I was young, and it sort of hit my imagination like really deeply, and it was like super scary, and yeah, it's a big loss today.
Well, movie lovers around the globe will certainly remember the immense contribution of William Friedkin to the world of cinema. Well, with that, it's a wrap on Global Lens. If you have been, thanks so much for watching. Do join us again tomorrow at the same time. Goodbye for now.
He thought he could outlast us. And 1 year later, the evidence is right here in this room.
Who